Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm joined here today with a very special guest, Ijaz the Trini, and he's going to be breaking down the Gospel of Mark, the authorship of the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to be reacting to a video. I haven't seen too many people putting stuff out there defending the authorship of the Gospels, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to see the arguments that are presented. Ijaz, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to this video because the person that we're reacting to, his videos on Islam get a lot of views, but his videos on Christianity usually get like half. So the audience that we're reaching out to don't seem particularly actually interested in the Gospels themselves.
Right. Hopefully they will be interested while watching this,
Yeah.
inshallah. By the way, to me, this is a huge deal. The topic of the authorship of the Gospels and the authenticity of the Bible as a whole, it's the biggest thing for me, akhi. It's the biggest thing for me. Um, the only reason, or not the only reason, but like the main reason that I cannot consider Christianity or Judaism is due to this specific issue. It's my main issue. So when I saw some of this stuff, I was like, maybe this stuff is worth an investigation, and that's why you're here. Um, so I'm quite curious to see what you're going to come up with and the thoughts that you have to share on this. And let's check out the presentation.
Inshallah. Here we go.
Let's go.
Welcome back to the series on the authorship and dating of the Gospels. We'll jump right to Mark. If you'll remember, in the introduction to this series, we heard from Martin Hingel. It must be asserted that in the present state of our knowledge, the titles of the Gospels are by no means late products from the 2nd century, but must be very old. With a considerable degree of probability, they can be traced back to the time of the origin of the 4 Gospels between 69 and 100, and are connected with their circulation in the communities. Their ultimate root lies in the terminology of Mark, who was the first to call a writing Evangelion, or Gospel. And we're going to hear a lot from Doug Moo.
If we pause there are actually a lot of issues in that first quote. I'm just going to go back a little bit so we can see the words on the screen here. He says, and he's quoting a scholar from 1985. Unfortunately for this claim, let's just break it down step by step. It says the titles of the Gospels are by no means late products from the 2nd century. And how the author demonstrates this, and how Colin from Islam Critique does the same, is by quoting people only from the late 2nd century, which is not evidential of the position he's trying to prove in the first place. So he quotes Tertullian, he quotes Irenaeus, he quotes Eusebius, he quotes Origen, all these people, to some of them at least, from the latter end of the 2nd century, all the way to the 4th. So it's interesting that his claim is premised on evidence which he cannot present. It goes on to say, with a considerable degree of probability, they can be traced back to the time of the origin of the 4 Gospels. You'll notice that the word in here does not say it can be traced back to the author, who is Mark, but really only to a range of dates of about 30 years. So Colin attempts to use this quote to say, because of this, we definitely know who the author is, whereas what the person is trying to prove in this quote, Martin Hengel, is that the time range that we can go back to for the attribution of authorship, not actual authorship itself. So it's two things which are competing here. Yeah.
Okay.
You said okay. Okay, so we'll take a look next at what he says about the terminology being used.
First to call a writing Evangelion, or Gospel. And we're going to hear a lot from Doug Moo and D.A. Carson in the series because their work is very recent. And so they do a really good job of surveying other relevant data on this topic, scholars who have gone before them publishing on this issue. So let's review just a little bit more of what we covered in the introduction video as they go right along with Hingel. We have no evidence that these Gospels ever circulated without an appropriate designation.
So I'll just pause again right there. We actually do have evidence. It's in Papyrus 1, and it actually does not have the title Katamathion. I can definitely say that Philip Comfort, in his New Testament text and translation commentary, he actually points out this, that the inscriptio, or the title for the Gospel of Matthew, is not there in one of our earliest manuscripts for Matthew P.
Okay.
So
Okay.
that's
This is just specific for Matthew. The rest, we do have the full titles for the rest, right?
yes. After this, definitely, but they were much later.
Okay. Okay.
According to Matthew, or the like. Papias once again comes down to us through Eusebius. It is in the following words: "This also the presbyter said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error, while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them. For he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely."
So we got to pause here again, because who is the source? So we have a giant gap from the first, second, and third century, and finally we arrive in the fourth, where Eusebius is quoting Papias. Now, Papias's works are no longer extant to us; they no longer survive. So we don't have any real reason to know whether Papias wrote this or not. But let us assume that Papias did write it. As is pertinent in the field of Hadith criticism, you have to look at the character of a person. And
Right.
Eusebius himself, in Church History, Book 3, Chapter 39, actually spells out that Papias is a person who believes wondrous things which are inaccurate.
Okay.
So,
So the original source that attributes this to Mark is not a reliable source, according to the person that's quoting him.
yes, he actually criticizes him for believing things too easily.
Right.
Tells us a lot at this point. Let's continue.
That's quite interesting. So Papias is the earliest person to
So,
have.
yes, traditionally, it is assumed that Papias did meet with some of the, not even the disciples or the apostles, but rather the students. So he's really interacting with people who are in the third and fourth generation, not necessarily from the first or the second.
Yeah.
And
Right.
one of the, so to be clear, we have no extant or surviving works of Papias himself. The only surviving quotes are in people from, like Eusebius, from the 4th century. So this gap cannot be ignored. But however, relevant to what we're stating here, Papias, if he did write these things, does tell us that it's not from the first or second generation of the Christians. So that even puts him even further. He's not a primary witness to determine who wrote what. And in
Right.
fact, there's a specific word he uses, anakrisis in the Greek. And this, some Christians have interpreted to mean that he interrogated people to get the truth of the matter. However, anakrisis is really where you ask preliminary questions like, oh, where did you hear that from? And what was the period you heard that in? And can you tell me something about yourself? It's not an interrogation where you try to falsify the person's statements. So
Right.
even Papias at this point, his methodology is not very reliable. And as a point of contradiction, Dr. Bart Ehrman has a wonderful article called Papias, an Eyewitness, where if what Papias says is true and accurate and we need to accept it, the death of Judas as recorded in the Gospels is a very different death that Papias himself argues for. In fact, if Papias is right, Judas dies in a way which is the complete opposite and has no relation to the sense in which he died in the Gospels. So it would seem strange that Papias is affirming that these authors wrote these Gospels. However, the stories within the Gospels are inaccurate, and the story that I have found out is the real one. So it puts.
What does he say? I'm quite curious, briefly.
So he says that Judas actually swells up to the point that he becomes so big he could not enter through a gate which a wagon can pass through, and then he exploded.
What?
Now, I read the Gospels. I don't see that story in there.
Yeah, I
So,
don't recall seeing.
so
Um,
yeah.
quick question about that. So does that mean that Papias doesn't believe in the inspired nature of the Gospels?
He does not seem to indicate that they were inspired in any direct way, and this does not seem to be the consensus at his time either. So when Papias actually writes this is actually quite disputed. I know that one of the scholars that Colin appeals to, Richard Borkham, puts it somewhere like in the 80s to about the year 100, but I've seen people like Bart Ehrman put it firmly in the second century. So scholarship is divided on this point, and so the person he's appealing to, there are a bunch of layered assumptions that he needs to make his argument, which does not lead to the conclusion that he wants us to be led to.
All right, let's carry on. Jazakallah khair, interesting stuff.
No problem.
The identity of the presbyter, and Papias quote, the importance of these claims is magnified when we realize that the presbyter Papias is quoting is the presbyter John, probably the apostle John himself. If Papias is to be trusted, the identification of Mark as the author of the second gospel goes back to the first generation of Christians.
Again, let's pause there. So in this quote, it actually raises an issue that a lot of Christians are unaware about. So early Christian tradition is actually confused about who John the Presbyter is. Is this the same as John the Apostle who followed Jesus? So can you imagine appealing to a certain John, but you don't know which John you're appealing to? Now, I'm not sure if this works well even in Hadith criticism. If the source you're appealing to does not know which the identity of the person he himself is appealing to, how can you then make that decision for him? That is an assumption, a layered assumption, and then follow through with that as a primary evidence. That does not seem to be the case. And as Colin did in a video a couple of days ago on the age of Rebecca, he looked at what the scholars had interpreted and said we can dismiss this assumption and that assumption. So following through using his own methodology, these are just layered assumptions. And we don't actually know which John is being referred to because the title used, presbyter, does not have to necessarily indicate someone from the first or second, but rather from the second and third generations of Christians. So this is just one opinion on that, based on what that one word presbyter means, whereas Papias himself does not identify that individual as being a disciple or apostle who lived at the time of Christ.
Okay. There's an important point. But actually, even before getting into that, what's the significance of this specific quote? He's saying, or Papias is providing his source here, or
he's trying to argue that Papias got this information from
okay,
possibly the Apostle John, who was one of the 12 with Jesus. But
right.
Papias himself does not say that. Rather, this is an interpretation of what the word presbyter means.
Okay, and what would it mean?
So it could mean elder in the church, but anyone at any point can be an elder if they've been in the church for long enough. It just means a person well
Right.
studied or who has authority. Like if you let me in Salah and I called you the imam, it does not mean that you're the imam of the ages. You can be an imam in
Right.
multiple aspects.
Or the fifth imam of the fifth madhab.
Yes, wrong, but yes.
All right, let's carry on.
You got me on that one. I gotta get you back now. Right, proud Hanafi. Right, let's move on. Unseen. All right, there we go.
Irenaeus states, wherefore also Mark, the interpreter and follower of Peter, does thus commence his gospel narrative, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which shall prepare thy way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make the paths straight before our God. Plainly does the commencement of the gospel quote the words of the holy prophets and point out him at once, whom they confessed as God and Lord.
Let's pause there again. So at the very start of this video, Colin makes the argument that the scholar he's quoting, Martin Hengel, makes the case that the Gospels did not get their titles at the end of the 2nd century, but rather somewhere between the year 69 and the year 100 within the 1st century CE. However, when you make a claim and then you qualify it with an evidence, the evidence should fulfill the claim that you're making. In this case, Irenaeus is writing about in the year 185, which is when? Towards the end of the 2nd century CE. So he appeals to a quote and a person that reflects the argument he is not trying to make, but rather disproves the argument he intends to make.
Justin gives us an early reference to chapter 3 of Mark's Gospel.
Interesting again. The way that he uses the term early is problematic here, but we'll continue.
Talks about Peter's name being changed in Mark 3:16. He says, "It is written in the memoirs of him that this so happened." And he also refers to the names of the sons of Zebedee being changed as well, referring to Mark 3:17. Tertullian says the same authority of the apostolic churches will afford evidence to the other gospels also, which we possess equally through their means and according to their usage. I mean the Gospels of John and Matthew, whilst that which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose...
So let's pause here briefly. It's interesting, the two quotes that he just presented. We'll come back to the dialogue with Trifo quote, but when you, because it is later, at least the evidence for it. But if we stick with this quote in particular, you will see that Tertullian is writing towards the latter half of the 2nd century, maybe early half of the 3rd century, of the first half of the 3rd century. So again, he is using a much later evidence to establish the claim that this was written between the year 69 and the year 100. So just to make it clear, all the quotes so far, he's trying to prove that the Gospel of Mark was written by a historical Mark between the year 69 and the year 100, but all of his evidence does not come from that time period. In fact, they come within the 2nd century, and almost all of them in the second half of the 2nd century, between the year 150 and the year 200. This one in particular being much later than the reference he's trying to give.
Okay, question about that.
Yep.
Isn't the fact that these sources, so most of them are late 2nd, early 3rd, right? Aren't these sources, since we have like multiple sources that early, wouldn't that suggest that the Gospel of Mark is somewhat early?
Actually, it doesn't. I'll tell you why. So it's an error that Colin himself also makes. So when scholars say that the title could have been known at that time, the Gospel according to Mark, what they are saying is that the title may have been known, that Mark may have written this work. However, they still consider the work to be anonymous, because within ancient literature, there was something called homonymity, where a person writes in another person's name. So just because the early church agreed that a person by the name of Mark wrote this, does not mean that they have any evidence that a historical Mark existed whom they can identify as being the primary author of this work. So again, this is why it's important to understand not just form criticism and early Christian history, but you have to know what homonymity is as a category for authorship within that time period when the Gospels were first written.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question, inshallah.
Yes.
It's a little bit complicated, but generally, just because the church, and this is not early, by the way, early would be contemporaneous. This is early in comparison to the fact that they have nothing early.
Right.
It's about 100 years later. It's a bit like if we had, the Quran circulating around the year 633, and then someone in 733 pops up and say for the first time, Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, actually wrote this, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You would say, but that's just over a century later. What happened in between? So the same kind of skepticism that they would have towards us, we have to apply the same standard as Mark chapter 4, verse 24 says. The standard you use will be the standard that you receive. So shall we continue, inshallah?
Okay, yeah, please.
and from Origen via Eusebius. The second is by Mark, who composed it according to the instructions of Peter. And finally, Clement gives the tradition of the earliest presbyters as to the order of the Gospels in the following manner. The Gospels containing the genealogies, he says, were written first. The Gospel according to Mark had this occasion, as Peter had preached the word publicly at Rome and declared the Gospel by the Spirit. Many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time and remembered his sayings, should write them out. And having composed the Gospel, he gave it to those who had requested it.
Again, let's pause there. So all of the quotes he is given is from one individual quoting earlier individuals. So he's
Right.
quoting Eusebius, who is quoting Clement, who he also quotes Origen, and he also quotes Papias. But the gap between these individuals is not minor, it's still insignificant. It's as if we had a chain of narrators and you had a claim from like the fourth or fifth person in the chain going back to the first and second, but that gap in between has no names. It would
Is
present
there, is there a reason? Is there a reason to assume that Eusebius may have made this up or that he's unreliable?
So Eusebius himself does say that it is okay to lie for the sake of the gospel. He actually uses the word agato sudistai, a good lie. So as long as the lie brings someone to believe, quote unquote, in the truth, it's okay to lie in that sense. And he actually quotes Plato in order to justify this claim.
Wow. So it is actually possible that all his attributions are false.
I would not say that all it's within the realm of possibility, but rather
Yeah.
I see him as a person compiling traditions about where the sources of the authorship may have come from. His collection of this data does not mean that he has actually validated and verified that this is the case. Rather, he's just writing what the church tradition says about the origin of the Gospels in the first place. And he's writing this 300 years after the fact.
You see, to be honest, before you mentioning that to me, about him saying that it's permissible to lie for the sake of
The Gospel.
the gospel, I think that I wouldn't have had an issue with him attributing something to an earlier source as long as he's seen as a reliable scholar generally. Um, his name, shows up a lot. It kind of maybe somewhat implies reliability, but him saying something like that, having no issues with lying, it just makes it hard for me to swallow.
It should be hard for you to swallow because we have the assumption that if someone is a historian that they're going to be somewhat objective. But he is right in the sense that he does tarnish the reputation of Papias. That's good to see that he is considering the validity of the person he's getting the information from. But we
Okay.
see no real examination as to whether or not it could have been possible that Mark, Matthew, John, or Luke did not write the Gospels attributed to them. And that is perhaps a problem if you're doing historical research.
Let's carry on.
Bismillah.
Over and over again, the connection between Mark and Peter. And so if the early Christians wanted to assign the anonymous Gospel of Mark to someone, Peter would have been a very good choice. He was an apostle. He was an eyewitness. Yet we find authorship of the Gospel attributed unanimously to Mark.
So again, this argument is not a very reasonable one. So if a person made up the gospel, let's assume someone made up the gospel and then they were thinking of an identity to put it towards, then why not Peter? Why did they put it to Mark? Well, if Peter has possibly already died at this point, which is the case, or if Peter was not known to have a gospel, in fact, the gospel of Peter was perhaps around in circulation about that time, if not a little bit after, so there's that conflation with the name, it seems more reasonable that people knew that he had an amanuensis perhaps writing for him by the name of Mark, so it logically follows that they would attribute it to Mark. If a gospel does circulate, and it does attach itself to the Apostle Peter, it makes sense that if Peter was not known to write a gospel himself, that the second best person would be his scribe or his amanuensis or his close friend and brother Mark. It makes sense. So that it makes sense does not mean that this is actually the person that wrote it according to what the tradition says.
I have something to add to this. Even in the Hadith traditions, it seems like the higher level liars, right? There are some liars that attributed the most obvious fabrications through really well-known asanid, through well-known sources. Those were the, those that were not professionals at what they were doing. While the more, the smarter liars, they would attribute reports to sources that were not as famous. They would come up with a chain of narrators that you've never heard of before, and that way it wouldn't be as suspicious. You would maybe suspect the source instead of suspecting them. If you're to attribute a hadith to, for example, Abu Huraira, okay, everyone like attributes a hadith to Abu Huraira, whether they're authentic or weak. But let's assume you attribute it to some unknown companion that not many have, that doesn't really have many hadith. The likelihood of you getting away with that may be greater, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe the spotlight will be on the chain up to him instead of, you get what I'm saying, instead of you.
So the brilliant thing about this is that in ancient literature, specifically Greco-Roman literature, it was seen not as dishonest, but rather honest if you made up a quote and you attributed it to someone else. This is known as ipsissima vox, or writing in the very voice of someone. Now, the reason that this was not seen as dishonest was if you legitimately believed that this is what the person would have said, it would have been okay to attribute that quote or that work or that word to them. So we don't need a conspiracy. We are just going by the general literary standards of that time. So we're using external factors, internal factors, evidences that help us lead us to our conclusion, which I don't think Colin goes into in this video or any video I've actually seen him record. Okay, shall I continue?
Let's.
Is this overwhelming you, the information? You thought it was better than this, like this?
It's not overwhelming me, but I'm assuming it's going to be overwhelming him if he watches this, and I'm sure he will.
We've only done 4 minutes. Oh my God. This is why you don't hire people like me.
No good reason for doing this unless Mark actually wrote the gospel. Connection of the Mark mentioned by the church fathers and the Mark of the gospel, that they refer to the John Mark mentioned in Acts and in 4 New Testament epistles is almost certain. No other early Christian Mark would have been so well known as to be mentioned without further description. Paul.
I want to point out here that this contradicts something he quoted earlier. So earlier he argues, in spite of the ambiguity of which John wrote the Gospel of John and which John Papias got the tradition from, here he reverses it. He says, because we have no other well-known Mark, it must mean that there is only this one Mark. So here is the reasoning he's using. If there's more than one John, or we can just attribute it to the earlier one, and if there's one Mark, then it doesn't matter if there were any other Marks that were not as well known, it's still that just one person. So he's contradicting the claims he is making, at least in the methodology that he seeks to employ.
I think I'd like to add something. I don't know if you're familiar with this. I was reading this earlier today. I'm sure you're familiar with this one. There is a British theologian called Dennis. Let me look it up.
I don't know anyone by the name of Dennis, so already
Dennis Nineham. Have you heard of Dennis Nineham?
Maybe I have, but I can't recall. No.
Okay, so he's a British theologian who has a piece or a book on the Gospel of Mark, and he claims that Mark was the most common name in
That error.
Rome. In Rome.
Perhaps it was. What I would point out is that a lot of the names used in as I would point out, a lot of the names in the Christian tradition are actually popular names. So, so they're very, very common. It's like the name Muhammad today. Every second person I meet is named Muhammad. So,
Right.
shall we get the show on the road?
Carry on.
Presence with him during his Roman imprisonment. Peter, writing from Rome, also mentions that Mark was with him, calling him his son, perhaps implying.
So there's a book by Professor Marcus Bockmuehl, Simon Peter in Scripture and Memory. And within the very first page, the very first paragraph, I believe he mentions that the search for the historical Peter runs swiftly into the ground. We generally are uncertain that anything survives from the historical Peter. We even First and Second Peter are doubted by scholarship generally. Second Peter more so, but doubts still exist about First Peter itself. So that First Peter does mention a mark is not necessarily evidential of anything.
Right.
Implying that Mark had been converted through his ministry. Doug and Don Carson conclude, yet as we have seen, there is nothing in the New Testament that is inconsistent with Papias' claim that Mark wrote the second gospel, and since we have no indication that anyone in the early church contested Papias' claim, we see no reason not to accept it.
Apart from the unreliability of Papias.
Yes. So there's a number of problems that we see here in the reasoning being employed. So it says, yet as we have seen, there is nothing in the New Testament that is inconsistent with Papias' claim that Mark wrote the second gospel, except for Mark, whoever the author was of the Gospel of Mark, not saying who they were. That would be the first problem, right? The second problem, he says, and since we have no indication that anyone in the early church contested Papias' claim. Now, this is an argument from silence because we don't know if anyone did contest it. So little survives from that time period, including Papias' work itself. We don't know what Papias himself could have argued later on. And the fact that he was willing, from what survives from his work in Eusebius's, to point out that the death of Judas is different from that in the Gospels, we actually don't know if he could have said something similar about some of the elements of the Gospel of Mark in his own time.
Okay, so you pronunciation again, Eusebius? Eusebius. Okay, so Eusebius was in which century again?
Fourth century in his writings.
Okay, so the earliest source that talks about this stuff in detail is a 4th century scholar who holds a position. He doesn't mention the possible existence of the other position, and therefore biblical scholars today assume that the attribution to Mark is correct.
Well, not all scholars. Generally across the board, almost everyone except conservative evangelicals argue that Mark is not a homonymous name, but rather a name of the actual Mark as mentioned in the Acts and possibly First Peter. So everyone generally believes that the gospel is homonymous. That's a form of anonymity, meaning it's just a popular name used at that time.
Okay.
And this is the standard position.
And what led them to that standard position, apart from the matters that you've mentioned just now?
So Christians themselves, because they've traditionally held this to be the author, regardless of the evidence, still hold to this. It's just a belief that they've held on to. But as time has progressed, as I noted, the consensus of scholarship shifted away from these being actually known persons in the community to just being popular names, to now being fully anonymous, using popular names at that time.
Now, do these Christians,
so scholarship has moved on.
Do these non-conservative Christians believe that Mark is inspired?
I don't know of any non-conservative scholar that does say it's inspired, but I do need to point out that the Christians themselves don't have just one model of inspiration, but multiple. And so that would be too much to get into in this video. But
okay, let's carry on.
Inshallah. Bismillah. Let's go.
Bismillah.
Influence. On Mark, there is much internal evidence in the gospel itself that attests to the same.
Bismillah.
While
I have to
founded
say
on four
something, Akhi. I have to say
Go ahead.
something here. I read the first gospel I've ever read was Mark. I still haven't read Matthew. I still haven't read Luke. I've just read Mark and John. And the thing that basically stuck out to me is there was no I said this to Jesus, or he told me. There was none of that, and that was the first thing that stuck in my mind when I was done. And it's really interesting to it's just really interesting that anyone would try to argue otherwise after that. I'm so used to every single hadith hearing the word haddathana, right? Or akhbarana, or haddathani, or akhbarani. He told me, I heard from him. This is just how hadiths work. And then you have this where you're stuck with books, or at least I don't know about Matthew and Luke, but Mark doesn't have a single instance of him saying, I saw Jesus, or Jesus told me, or any of that. And that's something that just...
So we need to keep in mind that, according to the Christians, Mark was not an eyewitness to any of these things, but
Yes.
supposedly he gets it from Peter. So it would
And there's
seem
none of that.
strange that he
There's
does
none
not
of
say,
that.
yeah, there's none of like Peter said to me.
Yes, yes. I think that's if I was there at the time, I would definitely say I would stick this in the first paragraph, and I would say this is the stuff that Peter said to me. I would do that to give this work some weight. I would do that.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the responses to you could be, why are you putting later literary standards on something that is much earlier? But the point is, other authors do identify themselves. They do speak in the first person. So this is not an anachronistic demand from Brother Farid, but rather a reasonable one.
Shukran.
An example to this is like the start of the Gospel of Luke. In the very first couple verses, it mentions the purpose, who he is writing to, etc. So so it makes sense that this information, it was not impossible to include it, but rather easily able to be included, and that it was not qualifies Brother Farid's point.
Now, Akhi, all right. Maybe we're going to get to that later, but just very briefly. We're not sure about the sources of Luke either, right? I mean,
No.
Okay.
So none of them are we certain about, and we will give our evidences for that. We're not going to do the sophomoric thing like Islam critiqued and just quote people from 35 years ago. That sounds so long ago to me. I can't even imagine being 35, but everyone's ancient these days, right, Brother Farid? Shall I continue?
All right, let's carry on.
Picture of the disciples as cowardly, spiritually blind, and hard of heart is particularly vivid in Mark. This, it is held, points to an apostolic viewpoint, for only an apostle would have been able to criticize the 12 so harshly.
That's
just silly, man. That's just silly. Like this would not fly. This would never fly in the Hadith. This would never fly. We don't know who the source is, but he criticized the narrators. That means he must have been there, or he criticizes the characters in the event. Therefore, he must have been. It's just absolutely absurd.
It is. Yeah. So let's continue. I just had to. I understand why they make these arguments, but just because someone makes argument does not mean it's a good argument.
The fact that this argument was made gives me a lot of doubt about the authenticity of this work.
What's particularly interesting is that I believe that the person who wrote this, Douglas Moo and Carson, they're trying to use what is called a criterion of embarrassment. So if you include an embarrassing detail, it is more likely to be true than less true. I mean, why would someone make up an embarrassing detail? Or maybe they included an embarrassing detail to give their work a touch of authenticity. So the question answers itself.
Okay.
Now, Moo and Carson suggest three other factors that point to Peter's influence in the Gospel of Mark. Peter figures prominently in Mark, and then citing Dodd, there's a pattern of the Gospel that's similar to Peter's words in Acts 10:36 through 41, and Mark is called my son in 1 Peter chapter 5.
Problems upon problems here. Okay, so he's given three evidences to prove that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark. But remember, we're using Collins' method here because he says that assumptions need to be removed and we need to read the thing as it actually exists. Remember, that's his video from the Age of Rebecca. Now, the first point he makes is that Peter figures prominently in Mark. Yes, he does. No one denies that. But him being an important figure could generally mean he was an important figure in the early church, and this person knew that fact. That does not mean merely because Peter was important that this somehow proves that the author of Mark knew Peter. Like, I'm pretty sure Donald Trump is popular in the world today. If I write an article about Donald Trump, it does not mean I know him. Uh, on the second one, the pattern of the gospel similar to Peter's words in Acts chapter 10, verses 36 to 41. So the pattern of speaking is something, again, which is suggestive and indicative as opposed to determinative. So it does not actually follow through that because the pattern of speech is similar, that it means it's the same. In fact, it's of note that Colin does not flesh this point out. And lastly, that he makes the assumption that because Mark is called my son in First Peter, that he knows who wrote First Peter. That's an assumption. And secondly, that just because the person's name is Mark, it's that they're the same Mark. As you will know, in logic, if I said, this is my car, and then Fareed comes along and says, this is my car, it does not mean that we are acknowledging that we have the same car. That's a contradiction. So I would point out here that merely by referencing Mark as his son, which is, as Brother Fareed pointed out, a very common name, does not mean it is the same Mark that the Christians believed in.
Right. In regards to the second point, couldn't one say that the author of Mark may have been influenced by Acts? He read Acts, and
that would be difficult because it's traditionally believed that Acts were written long after the gospel attributed to Mark. So generally that wouldn't work because they're a bit anachronistic. But we could say,
Okay.
however, if we take your argument and your claim that the Acts of the Apostles, the words in it clearly were adopted from Mark's gospel, and that is not unreasonable. There is a lot of harmonization between the histories and the gospel.
How about some of the attributions to Peter are correct?
They could potentially be, but then again, even the authorship of Acts itself is very disputed. A lot of scholars do believe, however, that the author of the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Acts wrote in the same general style, but that does not provide a definitive proof that they're the same person. We have to keep in mind that there are layered assumptions that are being made to lead Colin to his viewpoint. Whereas what we are saying is, okay, let's look at some of these layered assumptions and identify the pros and cons, the issues with them.
Okay. All right. Let's carry on. Jazakallah khairan.
Now, while this series is primarily concerned with authorship and dating of the Gospels, let's continue down this trajectory just a bit further and look at Peter's role as an eyewitness in the Gospel of Mark.
Let's pause there. So what Colin says is that this series is meant to determine the authorship of Mark. Small problem. None of the quotes he's provided so far from modern-day scholars indicates that a historical Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark. Rather, they were primarily interested in what the tradition of the early church attributed to Mark. That's a different point. And as you will notice later, what even Papias says about the origins of the Gospels, the very person he's citing from disagrees with that conclusion in the first place. So there is clearly a gap of understanding between what Christian tradition believes and what scholarship has come to their conclusions today about.
Okay.
Balcom notes in a recent article, after Jesus, Peter is much the most frequently named character in the Gospel of Mark. The point can be highlighted by observing that, although Peter is a prominent character in all four Gospels, the frequency of references to him in Mark is, in proportion to the length of the Gospel, the highest.
We've been through this. We've been through this. We don't need to spend more time on this. I wouldn't have put this in the video. If I was a Christian, I would skip this point. Just because they taught us in Bible school that these are the points that you're supposed to mention, I wouldn't mention this. It makes us look bad.
Inclusio with respect to how Peter is named in Mark's Gospel. Peter is both the first disciple of Jesus to be named in Mark's Gospel and also the last. In 1:16, the first reference, the occurrence of his name Simon is emphasized by a grammatically unnecessary repetition of it. The last reference to Peter, after one might have thought Peter had dropped completely out of the narrative, is in the penultimate verse of the Gospel, where the angel tells the women, "Go and tell his disciples and Peter."
We have to stop here. So his argument is that Peter is mentioned first and potentially last. That is wrong. We actually don't know how the Gospel of Mark actually ends. We have in the manuscript tradition roughly 5 endings.
He has another video on that. I think we should get to that some other time.
Balcom goes even further and says that Mark wasn't simply emphasizing Peter throughout his gospel. Rather, Mark was pointing to Peter as the named eyewitness behind his account. What the inclusio does is to confirm that Peter's pervasive presence throughout the narrative extends from the beginning to the end, making Peter's witness the overarching one for virtually the whole gospel narrative. Now, Balcom cites external evidence for this as well, after analyzing the work of the ancient Greek historian Polybius. So the pattern of reference in this account of Scipio and inclusio, along with the frequent reference within the narrative, forms a close parallel with the pattern of reference to Peter in Mark's Gospel. In Polybius' case, he also makes it explicit that Laelius was his principal eyewitness source.
Problem here. Just because he's mentioned often does not mean he actually identifies Peter as the eyewitness. He could have just taken one word, Peter was the eyewitness, full stop, that proves his point. But this seems again to be a layered assumption.
Yeah.
Balcom says, I argue in the book, referring to his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, that in the early church there was a principle of eyewitness testimony from the beginning, stated in Luke, Acts, and John, i.e. that the most important testimony was that of disciples who had been with Jesus from the earliest days of his ministry and could testify to the whole course of events up to and including the resurrection appearances. The references to Peter in the Gospel of Mark clearly put him into that category.
Problems here again. Just because the early tradition says that they got it from the disciples, which they don't necessarily say so, does not mean that the early tradition came from the disciples themselves. Here is a point which we need to consider. How often in the Gospels do they point out that one person or another has said something incorrect about Jesus? Not once, in fact. So if the authors were the disciples or they knew the disciples, then they should have been able to say, as the church fathers shortly thereafter, that X person held a false view about Jesus and one of the gospel authors corrected them, or that Peter rebuked X, Y, and Z for holding incorrect beliefs about Jesus. We never actually find this in the gospel tradition. Yes, it's belonging to a particularly literary genre of bioi, but the authors themselves within the Gospels have a lot of parenthetical comments. This is something that they could have mentioned as a parenthetical comment. The fact that they did disproves the assumption that Colin has used.
You've lost me completely. I'm sorry. You've lost me completely.
Okay, so basically all he's saying is that the Gospel traditions are believed to have originated from the witness of the disciples, yes?
Okay.
Right? And from this, he then argues that we can trust them because they come from the disciples. However, However, if that is the case, the idea that these gospels were circulated and well known, and that the eyewitnesses could correct false testimony, we never actually see the gospels pointing out that certain people had false testimony about Jesus, and they are given the right version of those stories in the gospels themselves. So
Okay.
because they don't correct any competing eyewitness testimony, could mean one of two things: that there were no people saying any false things about Jesus, and
Right.
therefore the eyewitnesses never corrected anything.
Right. Okay. Okay.
So,
That's a lot. That was a lot better.
sorry, it's the way my mind works.
Let's
Trinidad.
carry on.
The issue of date. Blomberg, with a number of other scholars, puts the dating of Mark's Gospel sometime in the 60s. It is also important to observe that Irenaeus claims only that the transmission of the Gospel occurred after Peter's death, not necessarily its composition. But if Mark wrote during Peter's lifetime, and if the early church tradition can be trusted that Peter was martyred under Nero before AD 68, then Mark must have composed his Gospel at some still earlier date, perhaps 64 to 65, when Nero's persecution was beginning.
So this is actually not evidential of anything. This is a person theorizing of what we would call the terminus postquem, the earliest date from which this gospel could have originated. So I think Colin misuses this to say that it can be the origin of this gospel is at that point in time, whereas what Craig Blomberg mentions here is that it could have been or must have been composed at some earlier date. And he specifies that the composition could have begun between 64 to 65. You would notice that the first line, the first sentence, the second line, not necessarily its composition, but rather that which was published at some other point in time. So it seems as if Colin does not understand the context of the quote.
Referring to the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, Irenaeus says, after their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter.
Written in the year 185, not as early as he claims.
Clement seems to indicate the date of Mark's Gospel could have been even earlier. And Peter makes mention of Mark in his first epistle, which they say that he wrote in Rome itself, as is indicated by him when he calls the city by a figure, Babylon. Now, if we have our chronology right, with Peter being in Rome, then this could push Mark's Gospel back even earlier into the 50s. In fact, John A.T. Robinson has argued for a date in the 40s. We have scholars arguing for dates in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. I'll put a couple of names up on the screen for each respective decade. And you can see I have the 60s indicated as a majority. According to most surveys, I think that's where you're going to find a large portion of New Testament scholars.
Could it be even later than that? Could it be past the 100? Is that possible?
It is possible, but not probable. So, in order for the early church fathers to be quoting it sometime within the first half of the second century, so between the year 100 and the year 150, it had to have circulated in some form by that point in order for them to be quoting it in the first place. But
Right.
what is interesting is that he actually concedes and he mentions that a lot of people place it in the 60s. The question is, of all those scholars, what do they place in the 60s exactly? Do they place the form as we have it today, the full text as we have it today, the 16 chapters with all of its variants in the first century? Or are they making the claim that whoever originally wrote the first redacted version of Mark would have been existent at that time? So there's a difference in New Testament textual criticism between when a work is first authored and when it is first published. There is no indication here that we know when it was first published. All we know is that the version that we have today represents a form of the text in the second century, not the form of the text within the first. And this is mentioned by Eldon J. Epp and many others.
Right. It's I think, do you feel that it's incorrect to assume, apart from the issue with the endings, because I know that there's a controversy around that, but in regards to the rest of Mark, is it fair to assume that what we have today does not represent what was there in the year 60?
Well, it would be difficult to understand what exactly was fully written in the year 60, because the way scholars have approached this is a lot of the gospel tradition has been harmonized between the different books. And so it makes it difficult. I would bring the point here that the UBS, I think it's the third and the fourth edition, used to keep a grading of how certain the scholars were about the variants that they had chosen to put into the text. And I think for the New Testament, it was something along the lines of 59% that they were uncertain or greatly uncertain about the variants they had chosen.
A date of somewhere in the 60s is probably without trying to narrow things down any more than that. So let's summarize what we've covered both in the introduction relevant to Mark as
He
well
looks
as
really happy, man.
it's
Too happy.
that have been renamed from another author and distributed so quickly. The book is universally ascribed to Mark in ancient tradition. It's implausible to assign authorship illegitimately to a non-apostle. We have no indication that the gospel ever circulated without an appropriate title. We have numerous connections between Mark and Peter, and they're attested to both in the New Testament and in church tradition. We have multiple indications of Peter's eyewitness influence in the gospel, and we find Mark's gospel was plausibly written in the 60s, though substantial arguments for earlier dates have been advanced.
Would you like to comment on this, Brother Farouk?
Okay, so I have a general comment I'd like to make, comparing this to Ilm al-Hadith, because Colin in one of his videos, makes this little remark, oh, you guys think it's like Hadith, as if Hadith and the Hadith system is less reliable than this. And the comment I'd like to make is, if we assume that Mark is actually the son of Peter, or a really close student. Yeah, I mean, refers to him, right? And he's really close to Peter, and he's his student, and he took much of it from Peter. This wouldn't cut it in Ilm al-Hadith unless we know for a fact that he took it from him. I mean, all we have is Peter being in these events. This is not sufficient for attributing or for authenticating a hadith. So, for example, Urwa ibn Zubair narrates that Rasulullah sallallahu had a discussion with Abu Bakr about Aisha before getting married to Aisha. You have hadith narrators saying that Urwa wasn't there. This hadith is flawed. This hadith is disconnected. You have major scholars of hadith saying this, including Abu Nu'aym, al-Humaydi, ad-Daraqutni. I believe even Sheikh Muqbil, contemporary scholar, says the same thing. And here's what's interesting about this. Most likely, Urwa took this from Aisha, his aunt. I mean, that's the most likely scenario. I mean, who else could have he gotten this from? However, since he did not mention his source, this single sentence, this one sentence, this like a line or two lines, the scholars spoke against this. They weaken this hadith just because of that, even though it's very likely they took it from Aisha. Now imagine they were that lenient, right? I mean, akhi, can you imagine authenticating a whole book? We're talking about a sentence. These guys are authenticating a whole book without even knowing that Mark took all these things from Peter. And the evidence is, he mentions Peter a lot.
What hurts me is that this list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things all hinges on assumptions. Do you realize that? It's plausible. There are indications. These are all indirect ways of saying we have no primary evidence for the claim that we're advocating.
What's the strongest evidence against this being written by Mark? Or
no early attestation.
Say again?
No early attestation.
Okay.
So it's not early, and nothing survives from that time, which would help us make an early attestation more
Okay.
likely than less likely.
I would say the lack of the author saying, "I heard from Peter," and or mentioning one source. Akhi, just mentioning one source and the whole thing, that would have made it so much better. But failing to even do that, failing to say, "I heard from him, he told me," that really causes me to have major doubts about this.
And just imagine your entire faith rides on
Yes,
the assumption that there were
yes,
indicators that it could be plausibly true. As a
right.
Muslim, that would not cut it for me.
Yes, yes. And wallahi akhi, يعني, subhanallah, it's again, it's one of the main reasons why I can't consider Christianity. Um, Now, I don't know about the other works. Does it get better for the other works?
If it got better, we would not be sitting here today.
Okay, okay. I'm curious to see what you have in store for me in the next one, Zakhi.
I look forward to it, inshallah. Thank you for
Barakallah.
having me.
Habibi, jazakumullah khairan. Guys, be ready. There's more to come. See you guys in the next one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.